Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? There you go. Your dial set correctly to USA Prepares. We're delighted you're with us in class today. Broadcasting 2 hours, 9 a.m. through 11 a.m. Central Time. Jason is engineering the broadcast in Minnesota. Thank you so much, Jason. And we've got a call-in number. If you'd like to call us, we'll pay for the call. 866-582-9933. 866-582-9933. Rich Sheben's with us. Welcome, Rich Scheben.
Thank you, Vincent Finelli. How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you. You know, you and I were chatting off the air about a number of things, and I'm so glad that you and I are back on today to talk about them. Where do you want to start, Rich Scheben?
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Senator Ron Johnson and the unconfirmed whistleblower about the secret society and everything that William Binney and Kevin Shipp and other hero whistleblowers have done for the benefit of average Joe Americans. And I sure hope that the American people continue to be whistleblowers and realize that we can no longer live in an emperor has no clothes society where the police state uses censorship and surveillance to control every one of us every minute of the day. And I guess what I'm saying is we can no longer be content to live in the every man for himself world America has become by the control of the elitists. So it's up to us, citizen journalists, it's up to us to step forward and give ideas and solutions to the people. And to answer your question with specificity, Vince, I think what we should do is you suggested that you really enjoyed some of the ideas and solutions that I gave the other day, and as you know, I talk with almost redundancy about practice what you preach laws, because I think the American people are tired of hearing words like hypocrisy and double standards, or that's the way it is, or it'll never change. And as you know, I regard that to be a poster boy or girl for ignorance, apathy, and indifference. And it's up to us to say it like it is. And we can no longer follow laws that the aristocracy doesn't. And especially where the bottom 93%, where the aristocracy divides us by race, gender, sex, religion, ideology, generation, and race baits and gender baits around every corner, especially on the mainstream media. And as you know, their job is to sway public opinion and hold on to the narrative. So we have to make sure we're aware that the United States of America has turned into the divided groups of America, and we need to stand for principle. And as you know, I define that as the same rules, laws, and accountability for everybody. We need to have truth. Everything needs to be based on truth and not subjective emotional opinion, but objective facts. And if someone has a lesser consequence for their behavior because of what group they're from, then we should do it too. So you mentioned we should talk a little bit about practice what you preach laws. And, you know, when I go through things pretty quick because, as you know, Vince, we're lucky if we get through 10% of our data on a given show. And I think we should talk about practice what you preach laws at least for a few minutes. And one of the big things that I talk about, and you can let me know what you think, is gun protection laws, where you have these elitists who say we need to get rid of all guns, while the Democrat blue state cities have the highest gun deaths when they have gun-free zones to protect their citizens. And they're saying that the poor and middle class can't protect themselves while they have the audacity to hire security, often in political positions where they use taxpayer dollars to hire security to carry weapons to protect their butts. And
Mayor Bloomberg.
What do you think about that?
Mayor Bloomberg of New York City did that. When he traveled outside the country, he had an entourage, a security squad, armed, and so he can say, I don't believe in guns. I believe in a small army of people following me and ahead of me and alongside of me with guns. I mean, what we need to do is not listen to what they say. We need to watch what they do. And there you have it. So if you look at Bloomberg, that's what he does. He has guns protecting him, but he doesn't probably. I'll bet you he does carry one, but he wants us to think that he doesn't. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Practice what you preach is so important. And one of the things that you and I discussed is if we had practice what you preach laws, everything would be better. Everything you'd think of would become better. Because you wouldn't have these people saying, we've got to reduce the carbon footprint. And yet they have, jets. And they fly they fly lots of places where they could just get in an automobile and get there. I'm not talking about flying different continents. I'm talking about why does the president need such a big jumbo jet? Really? Why? Can't fly in a little, smaller jet, like a Learjet or a Gulfstream, Falcon? Why can't they use those? I don't know. But that's what happens. And it's not just, and when they land, they don't land with a little helicopter. It's a massive, massive helicopter, burning an enormous amount of fuel. It's wrong. They're not leading by example. They're saying, do what I do because I say it, not leading by example. And that's wrong as well.
Well, if you look at the official authority narrative, do you really want to have our official authorities telling us what to do? Look at the DOJ. Look at the FBI. Look at the CIA. Look at the NSA. We truly are living in an emperor has no clothes society. And you mentioned carbon footprint. Look at the Davos meeting. There's over 1,000 private jets that flew into this meeting. Again, we can no longer accept the same people saying we need to have carbon taxes, and they talk about global warming, while they are flying around in jets all around the world, not just private, but commercial jets as well. And they're living in huge homes, and often multiple homes around the world, and their carbon footprint is 1 million times what the average Joe is. And I have some other ideas here. Look at Common Core. How many times have you seen and heard and read certain elitists saying how we need to have Common Core in public schools? They need to teach little children how to give BJs in schools and sexual identity lessons at 6 years old, while they send their kids to private schools. How about discrimination laws? How many times do you hear, oh, well, we have a discrimination lawsuit here, but it all depends on what group you're in. One attorney told me that I don't have enough group self-pity points as a poor/middle-class white male. And as you know, white males have nothing to do with it, because I think I mentioned that just last time I was on the air with you, Vince. Do you think that they're going to confiscate the wealth of Zucker, Rothschild, Rockefeller, Gates, Jonathan Gruber, Jeff Bezos, Soros, Murdoch, the Clintons? Oh, and by the way, don't forget Zuckerberg mentioned how stupid the American people were. Oh, and Jonathan Gruber, who was the main architect of Obamacare, he said how Americans are so stupid. So it's amazing that if one of us says anything derogatory to any specific group, we'll get lambasted on the mainstream media. But yet, if you come from a certain aristocracy, have certain money, or do something that controls the masses, that distracts them, that divides them, that makes them dumber, then you get a pass. And a great example is Netflix. Netflix I don't even think they've run a profit. And yet their stock is worth billions. On paper, they're worth billions, but profits don't mean anything. But see, the powers that be use Netflix for movies to pass subliminal messaging along to make the people think a certain way. And the distraction of having people watch Netflix movies for 2-3 hours a day keeps them. It's just like having drugs and alcohol available for the bottom 93%. And I've mentioned this many times, 7 to 8 hours per day, the average person on television and their smartphone. We need to learn to garden. We need to start talking and having intellectual communication and dovetail political, social, financial, economic discussions, because we are getting bombarded with group identity politics, Hegelian dialectic, professional wordsmithing, media propaganda, and it's not doing any benefit to the people. But I digress here. Let me get back on track. How many times have you seen producers, directors, and actors, Vince, talking about, we need to help the people, the poor people, but yet they make so many of their movies abroad so they don't have to pay certain fees. It's unbelievable how many movies are made in Canada.
We were talking about that last night. Mrs. Finelli and our son and I were in the kitchen, and the topic came up, donate money to preserve film that will be lost because of deterioration. So you can send money to have film restored and preserved, through a different medium. So, go from film to digital, and we can preserve these old movies. And Mrs. Finelli said, what about the people who benefit the most from having movies available in the first place? What about having them pay for it? They have so much money. How much money do some of these guys make and gals make per movie? 30 million, 20 million, 50 million. Why can't they shed some of their wealth to preserve their own self-interests? Why not? Why expect the little guy to do it? Exactly what you're talking about, Rich Scheben. OffGridMontana.com. Rich, when we were off the air a couple of days ago, we were talking about, what's wrong with America and how did we get here? And one of the things that we talked about was performance appraisals or performance reviews. And did you ever have one of those where, your employer said, hey, Rich, let's sit down on Tuesday and we'll go over your performance. Let's compare notes because your continued employment is going to be based on this, and whether or not it'd be implied, whether or not you receive a raise will be based on the discussion that you have with your boss about what you did for the company. Did you ever have one of those?
Well, sure, and they were typically very good until I got diagnosed with nerve damage, and then I asked, with permission from neurosurgeons and orthopedic surgeons when they wrote my company, to ask for a part-time job share to reduce my driving. And then once I did that, then my reviews became very negative. So that's liability paranoia and political correctness, because they told me that part-time job shares were for women only, and I ended up working another 7 years and pretty much deteriorated my spine. But I still do a lot of things. But anyway, I digress here, but it all depends on if you hold the political correct narrative or not, and that's what the bottom line is. Vince?
Yeah. Well, I worked for a bank, and while I worked for a bank, I noticed something very interesting, something I've never seen before, and that was the bank hired some former General Electric management people, and they have their own style of management. Now, for example, General Electric has what many companies have, which would be an annual performance review. But the style of management was such that they would fire the bottom 10% every year. Now, there's always going to be a bottom 10%, no matter what the company is. But do you have to fire the bottom 10%? Well, General Electric figured that, well, they're the bottom 10%, they got to go. So they'd fire them every year based on what? Based on performance appraisals or performance reviews. And that's pretty subjective. Well, my performance review was very interesting with a General Electric boss in the banking environment. And what he would do is he would give me a blank performance appraisal form, the same one he was going to use. And he would say, here, this is your performance form. Why don't you fill it out? I'll fill out one just like it, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. We'll compare them. We'll see what you think versus what I think. Okay. So I did that. And it went like this. So, Vinny, what have you done for us during the past 12 months? Now, bear in mind, I was a computer systems designer, a computer systems integrator. I built the equipment. I installed the equipment. I specified what hardware I was going to use. So I did it all from top to bottom. And I trained the users. And I wrote the manuals. And I wrote the flow diagrams. So it's not like I left some parts unfinished. Well, the discussion would be, so what have you done for us during the last 12 months? And I'm thinking, are you serious? I don't do anything that lasts just 12 months. Because the window was, I don't want to hear about what you did that's going to last into the future. I just want to know what you did that's going to give us money that is going to be a measure of your worth, Vin Finelli, during for 12 months. Well, when I built a computer system, I would buy better cabling. I would find the best price, and I would buy the best cabling because I didn't want problems. I didn't want failures of cables and connectors to enter into the equation. So I spent a little bit more. I bought uninterruptible power systems so that the computers would not, and the equipment and the modem rack and all of that would not experience electricity surges and brownouts that would cause the computer equipment to be unreliable. I wrote the flow diagrams of how the systems worked. I produced the wiring diagram so someone following me could figure out, in my absence, what I've done. I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get back and why that's a bad thing to do. Rich Sheben's with us, and we're talking about what's wrong with America. We're not talking about the General Electric management style. So, some of the things I did were really bad for me as an individual, because the computer systems that I built had let's say a 5 to 10 year or more life expectancy. Well, but I wasn't measured based on the life expectancy of the systems. I was measured based on how much money did you save us? How many employees did you eliminate? How did you drive our costs of operations down? How'd you do that? Well, so by the 12-month standard of measurement, I was penalized for building systems that would be more durable in the long run. Now, according to this management style, I should be focused on one thing, short term. What can I do to drive the costs lower right now? Okay? And let me give you an example. Let's say I were in the General Electric dishwasher manufacturing division. I'd be better off with my performance reviews if I made the chassis of the dishwasher thinner, lighter, okay? Using less steel. I'd be better off if I shortened the wiring harness to the computer for the control of the electronic dishwashing systems. If I could move it, if I could shorten that wiring harness, moving that computer motherboard, computer main board into an area of higher humidity, well, that's okay because, I saved X number of cents per dishwasher manufactured by doing that. If I made a thinner tub for the dishwasher, a thinner plastic or metal tub, but used less material, even if it were less durable, I'd be measured by saving more money, and that would be positive for Vin Finelli. If I were in the refrigerator or freezer division of General Electric, if I figured out a way of eliminating the wheels on the bottom of the refrigerator or freezer, so you could roll it out, clean the coils behind it, clean behind the refrigerator or freezer. By removing the wheels, I could save money and improve my performance. Think about that. Well, that's their style. That's the style of General Electric management. And if you apply that style to products that we see, that's what's happening all around. We are building products that are weaker, shorter life expectancies, all by design. And if you think about Fukushima, I've said on the air, who would go out in a boat a mile off the coast of Japan and say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's litter that coastline with nuclear reactors. What a great idea. Who would do that? Well, that'd have to be someone who likes the General Electric management style. Build it and get out of there. That's what's happening to this country. Build it cheaper. I mean, we used to say back in the 1960s, if something said made in Japan on the bottom, it was absolute junk. If you bought a General Electric radio or an RCA radio, Radio Corporation of America radio, I'm talking about a table model radio, in its day it was great. It was made in America. There was pride. It would last decades. It would be serviceable. You could change the tubes. Back then you could just take a couple screws off the back, and homeowners would take out the tubes of the radio, bring them to the drugstore or the supermarket where there are tube testers. You could drop the tube into the socket, turn the dials to the appropriate settings for that particular tube, press the test switch, and you'd read on the meter, good, weak, or bad. And you could buy that tube right then and there, take it home, plug it in, and your radio would be better. You could do the same thing with your television. Well, we've forgotten how to do that by design, because our management style says, don't do that. We're going to measure you on what you've delivered for us right now. We're not interested in the long term. Now think about this. The kind of computer systems I built were on the early days of press 1, press 2, press 3 on your phone. Remember that? I built one of the first ones. It wasn't just me. There was a whole team of us. But we built one of the first ones in the country. Now, do you think that when we built that, we said, you know what? It's only got to last through our performance review period. That's all we got to do. 12 months. Of course not. We built these things to last. And unfortunately, that technology has caught on, and it's pervasive. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Bottom line, Rich Scheben and class, is what we're doing wrong. One of the things we're doing wrong is we're measuring employee performance by the General Electric management style. And if you don't get it right, and you're in the bottom 10% of that company that manages by this style, you're going to be fired. So now everybody's thinking, gosh, why should I build something for the long run? I need to think like immediate. I need to save my own neck. So let's save money. Let's drive out durability. Let's drive out manageability. Let's drive out maintainability. And let's make things disposable, quick and cheap. And that's what we did all over the country. If a computer monitor fails, what do we do? Think about that. How many people would say, oh, my monitor just stopped working. I guess I can't fix it. I guess I'll get another one. That's what we do. We throw them away. Do we repair anything that is computer powered? If you have an iPad and the battery gets weak, do you get a new battery, or do you say, well, geez, it's 4 years old, I'll get another one? Think about that. And that's what's happening with automobiles. I've been harping on this beet juice and salt on the roads and how it's causing accelerated wear. So this 10-year-old truck or so, if you have a 2007 model and the brake lines have rusted through, wow, it's $1,900 to get the brake lines fixed. And that's if you don't have any problems with the calipers. The bleeder valves getting rusted on the calipers for the brakes. Well, if that happens, then, gosh, now you're up to $3,000. Might as well get a new truck. Because the brake line's rusted? Seriously? That's where we are. Rich Scheben?
Well, I can go in many different directions here, but basically what you're saying is lowering the bars of standards and expectations and eliminating foresight. And that's one of the reasons, I love to do my economic 101 analogies, but it's proof that our economy is slowing down. I mean, Trump's doing some really good things, but he inherited sabotage and demolition, as I always say. I'm a little skeptical on what he can do. I think he's trying to do a lot of great things, and he has accomplished some. But when you look at this world economy, you look at our disposable personal income is barely hanging by a thread. Savings rate is a 10-year low. Debt, all-time high. With the yield curves, it's pretty obvious that credit is collapsing. Even the IMF admits that 100 to 200 basis point increase, basically a 1 to 2% increase in interest rates, everything can collapse, including a minimum of 20% of U.S. corporations. We're talking about this fall heavy QT, or quantitative tightening, basically when bonds mature, that money's not being reinvested into the system. There's definitely a lower velocity of money growth, especially for the bottom 93%, which basically makes two types of economies, one for the top 7% and one for everybody else. The demographic issues, where the largest increase in demographics over the next 25 years is basically the old folks. And as you know, because they're poor and their interests and hobbies are regressing, that they're spending a lot less money in the system. And this is all going to cause, I believe, Treasury yields to decrease, because all this talk about increased interest rates, I think it's going to happen in the short term, but in the long term, interest rates are a function of wages, economic growth, and inflation. I try to say that as often as I can when appropriate. And wages are certainly not going up, especially with the advent of robotics, automation, artificial intelligence. Economic growth is absolutely not growing. It depends on what you read, but I don't think it's growing at a significant pace, and inflation has been basically exported to low-cost producing countries. And even if these companies come here, they're not, today's corporations, quote-unquote American corporations, they're not even investing in their core business practices. They're not investing in their people and their services and products and R&D, and even thinking long-term. They're thinking short-term, basically to feather their own nest with low-interest loans, and especially at the executive level, like the CEO and CFOs. They're feathering their own nest with stock options, and they're paying off dividends, and they're buying people off, and buying back their own stock. With the help of central banks, and that's the majority of the numbers. All the numbers in the books are cooked. So, with inflation going lower and minimum wage jobs, even though they're more, it actually contributes less to full-time work that's available. So I just see negative benefits to workers and in our overall economy in the long run because of these new business practices. We don't practice business the way we used to. More people are getting squeezed out of the workforce, again, with the new technologies. And the tax cuts, I just see them short-term being better for the little guy, but between the stock buybacks, the dividends, the stock options, mostly for the executives, and the mergers and acquisitions, I see an issue of more debt and more corporations leaving their core business plan, which makes them think more short-term. So I'm just skeptical on the direction we're going as a country with business practices. It doesn't look good for the little guy. Vincent?
Yeah. I've got a comment, maybe a couple comments when we come back. You might find it interesting. Don't touch that dial. Rich Sheben's with us, offgridmontana.com, offgridmontana.com. So, Rich, we were talking about what's wrong with America, and as you were describing your thoughts during the previous segment, I was thinking about what happened here at our farmhouse, and I imagined a scenario like that, but just one little twist different. So around the kitchen table, there was Rich Scheben, Rick Miller, Matt Stein, Ed Marvini, Aaron Dakins, John Statmiller, Grace Thorne. So we're in the kitchen. Mrs. Finelli's there. Our boys are there. and we're having a discussion. So having like 7 discussions simultaneously, and everybody's paying attention to each one of these. And it's really a lot of fun. And so here's the little twist. This is the imaginary twist. So there's another guy there, this imaginary guy. He shows up, and we say, hey, so what do you do? He says, well, I work for General Motors. I'm an engineer in the truck division. So the next statement that comes from the group is, so you're the guy who designed these brake lines that rust prematurely, right? And he goes, no, you don't understand. You don't understand. See, I got this boss, and he came from General Electric. We inherited this guy. Our whole engineering team inherited this vice president, and he came from General Electric. You don't understand the pressure we were under. He said, you will lower the costs of this truck, whatever you got to do. And the only thing left was to remove the plating that protected these brake lines from rust. So we had to take that off because that costs a little bit extra. So in order to save our jobs, we had to do that. You don't understand the pressure we were under. We didn't want to do it. We had to do it. That's the kind of thing that I think was happening all over the country, just using General Electric as an example. And, when we discuss cars here at the farm and trucks here at the farm, and someone says Ford, I say, yeah, I know about Ford. Seems like those are the guys who, if it took 4 bolts to hold something onto the vehicle, they used 3. That's the feeling I had about Ford. And if you look at a Ford truck and you sit in the seats of a Ford truck, you go, wow, they must have had a boss that came from General Electric because they took the padding out of the seats. We don't need any padding. Heck, just make it look nice. It doesn't need to be comfortable. Just make it look nice. That's the kind of thing. Image, features, buttons, screens. That's what people are buying. They're not buying durability. Does anybody remember that Maytag, you could buy a clothes dryer from Kenmore or Philco or RCA Whirlpool or Maytag, and if you looked at the Maytag demo board above the dryer, they would say, here's their pulley, here's our pulley, here's their V-belt, here's our V-belt. This is why we're better, because ours is bigger, thicker, stronger. It'll last longer. That was how they sold them, based on durability. Does anybody sell anything based on durability? What you can do is you can buy a extended maintenance contract from a third party that has no idea what the products are like. But for an extra 10%, you can warranty it for a full year. Heck, not 90 days, but a full year for 10% more. And then you think, why would I do that? Because I'm going to throw it away in 3 years. That's where we've arrived. Rich, are your thoughts different, or do you think that's
Well,
right?
It's all interconnected. It's pretty easy to connect the dots. We've been groomed to accept lower quality. And it's pretty obvious. I've been talking about this for years. The powers that be have purposely, by design, lowered the bars of standards and expectations for getting a job based on what group you're in. So it's pretty easy for them to justify and connect the next dot. And the American people, especially the bottom 93%, reap not the benefits, but the cons.
Yeah, and when we talk about the bottom 93% class, I've mentioned this to Rich off air, that I try to follow that up by saying, that's us. That's us. We're in the bottom 93%.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Rich Shealy, thank you so much for being with us today and spending your non-replaceable time.
My pleasure, as always, Vince.
See you next week. Everyone all set? Cocked, locked, hour number 2 of USA Prepares. I'm delighted to be broadcasting with Bert Bertonis, CEO, patent engineer, electronics designer in Silicon Valley. Welcome, Bert.
Glad to be here, Vince.
I was just thinking about the time you and I were stomping around in Marley Woods, looking for evidence of what we were told was, unidentified flying objects in that area of Missouri. And you came out from California, and we took a ride out, just to see what was what, to see if we could see or find any evidence of what the natives were talking about in the area of Marley Woods in Missouri?
Well, that's probably a good another show, maybe 2 hours, to discuss some of that. But today I thought we'd go back to 1859 and talk about something that was pretty remarkable and is almost certainly going to happen again. So picture the year 1859, September. Back then, there were no electronics, no television, no radio. Telephones were being played with, but nothing really there. There were no automobiles, and most people walked to get somewhere. They had just invented and started using telegraph, which is a very primitive communication system, basically one wire with the ground to complete the circuit, and that had been up and working. And something very strange occurred in September of 1859. All of a sudden, telegraph sets were blowing up. Telegraph operators were getting electrocuted, literally their hair standing up, falling out of their chairs. Railroads, which were the primary way of mass transportation, rails, the metal rails on the rails, were actually bending and warping. So, what do you think was causing that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Well, I know what caused it. If you're talking about 1859, you're talking about the Carrington event. And you're talking about a massive, massive solar flare emanating from the sun. It hit the Earth, and it was looking for antennas, and it found them. It found them in the wires that were suspended, insulated by telegraph poles. And it found another antenna, which many people might not think of, is the railroad tracks, because railroad tracks are raised on these wooden railroad ties, so they're semi-insulated from the ground, and they're parallel wires. You know, each track would be like a wire, all connected. And yeah, it made a lot of sense. That was a huge antenna for the solar flare to hit and to heat up and warp with electricity. And you're absolutely right.
And what's interesting is nobody really knew at first what was causing it. The storm is named after a astronomer and physicist named Carrington in England who observed it in September, late August and early September of 1859. But there was no national news, international news. There was no way for that news to carry. So he observed it, but here in the United States, people didn't really know what was going on. There were solar flares that were causing aurora borealis as far south as the Caribbean Ocean. There were very strange lights in the sky, but we weren't really sure. Now, Carrington rightly associated it with a sunspot eruption that occurred on the Earth. On the sun, and then came to the Earth. So every 11 years, we go through a solar cycle, and that's been going on as long as we've been able to measure it. And that was at the peak of a solar cycle 10. We're now in solar cycle 24. So in solar cycle 10, there was this massive eruption. At first, you would just see the light that would travel at the speed of light, so you could see the sunspots. In some cases, it took a day or two for some of the other effects to reach the Earth. What was interesting is the frequencies seemed to be fairly low frequencies compared to what we do now in radios. So it wasn't microwaves. It was more in what we would call middle wave and high frequency, things that would affect shortwave radio if we had it, but we didn't. So what it affected is what existed, and that was primarily telegraph. And, in fact, we had just completed the first telegraph line between America and Europe, just built, and it blew up from this. The above-ground wires picked up the energy, and it blew out the lines under the ocean. And that later caused AT&T to figure out how to build a better underwater long-distance telegraph and eventually other types of cables. So it was an amazing event. And the reason we talk about it now is it's for certain going to happen again. We don't know how soon it'll happen. It could be in 100 years. It could be in 10 years. It could be next year. Probably won't be right now because we're at a solar minimum. And so it'll be about 4 or 5 years before we hit the next solar maximum. But really, there's no reason it couldn't happen at any event. I mean, an event like that at any time with very little warning. Just basically we'll see some sunspots erupting.
You know, as you say this, one of the things that comes to mind very easily would be supply chain disruptions. Because pretty much everything today is processed with computers. I can't think of too many things that don't have computers in the manufacturing, supply, distribution, sales, marketing, and delivery, right?
Well, we can theorize on what's going to happen, and because of the frequencies that are associated with this, it isn't going to possibly be the direct destruction of semiconductor chips and microelectronics, but almost certainly it'll be damage or possibly complete destruction of our power grid, because they have the long lengths of wire that would be susceptible to this. So that means blowing out the transformers, blowing out the different relay stations and power generation stations, and there's not a lot of backup. We don't have a supply of the transformers. There's not much we could do immediately. So the problem is we would lose our electricity. So in effect, we would lose all our computers, but not because they were necessarily directly damaged, but because there would be no power to power anything. We would lose it, and at some point we could even run out of diesel fuel for backup generators, because in order to pump gas and diesel fuel, you need electricity. So that's really the problem, is our power grid in terms of a solar storm.
So I was thinking about what you were saying with the transformer. So it seems to me that if we wanted to make another transformer, so one blows up, and let's say we have a source, whether that source be in the United States or China or India or wherever that source is for manufacturing these transformers, they need electricity in order to operate the machinery to to draw the copper for the windings, the iron for the plates, the cooling oils, the stamping machines that make the fins for cooling, the fans when some of these transformers have fan cooling to assist on very, very hot days, to keep the transformers from overheating. So electricity is absolutely needed for the manufacturing processes of rebuilding the electric grid, right?
That's completely true. And, people have started to think about it, and there's studies going on. There's a congressional inquiry. There's some research organizations that are looking into what we need to do. But it's not going to be enough if something happens in the next few years.
Bert, I've seen you on the engineering bench in Silicon Valley, and I've seen you look at circuit boards and circuitry, and I've seen you design circuitry. And I know for a fact that when you look at designing electronic equipment, one of the things that goes through your mind is, okay, well, what if there is an electric surge? What if there's too much power? Where do we put that power? Where do we dissipate that power? How do we prevent this new device from being blown up by static electricity, line voltage, whatever it is?
Sure.
Those thoughts go through your mind. How is that possible that a designer of the grid would not say, heck, we are building the world's largest antenna array? How could they not think that this could happen on a larger scale when engineers such as you have figured this out easily, that this is a problem?
Well, that's a good question. And let me mention, when I'm looking at that from a design of a circuit board, I'm not thinking of an effect from the sun. What I'm thinking of is from other circuits on the board, from other devices, also keeping it shielded to meet FCC regulations. I'm not really thinking about, on that circuit board, what's going to happen from a sun eruption or, for that matter, from an atomic blast, which is EMP, which is something else we can talk about. But the people who do think about that is certainly the government. When they are building military systems, they are considering the effects of EMP, and it's very similar to what would happen from the sun, possibly different frequencies.
Let's talk about that when we come back. Bert Bertonis is with us, Silicon Valley engineer, designer, patent holder. He sits on the board of corporations in California in the electronic world. We'll be right back. Full name would be nuclear electromagnetic pulse, but we just call it electromagnetic pulse, or EMP for short. Yeah, please tell us about that.
Well, a nuclear bomb does have a large emission of radiation, and it's kind of sad that they can actually design the bombs to have more or less radiation. So you've heard of the neutron bomb, which is a lot of radiation. So the problem is that a very small nuclear bomb that's exploded in the atmosphere at a point where it doesn't even do a lot of destruction to anything on the ground will emit a large burst of electromagnetic energy, and that's actually even worse than what we would get from the sun, because typically the energy will be very broadband, including microwaves and millimeter waves, and those frequencies actually will destroy microelectronics. So with something like that, we could see cell phones and automobiles and computers being directly destroyed. And that's actually what we fear most from something like a rogue state like Iran or North Korea. And that's why we have to hope that we have missile defense in place to be able to shoot down one of those missiles if something ever happens. So it's potentially even worse than what we would get from the sun because of the broad spectrum nature of the radiation. So, some people might think, well, gee, this happened in 1859, maybe that was like once in 1,000 years or 10,000 years, but actually it has happened since, just not with the same severity. Most recently, the worst one we've had was in 1989 when we had a solar flare that literally plunged everybody in Quebec into darkness. 6 million people lost power for 10 hours, and the whole thing occurred in about 90 seconds. And the effect was so strong from the solar flares that as far south as New Jersey, power transformers were blowing up, and U.S. was able to keep the power going, but in Quebec, which was basically where the solar flare landed on the Earth, they were totally without power for 9 to 10 hours.
I remember...
So these things do happen.
I remember that, and I remember reading about people being stuck in elevators. They're on their way up or on their way down, and they just stopped. And you're absolutely right. And so we kind of take for granted the electric grid. I was at a meeting of the annual meeting of the Electric Cooperative in August, and one of the statistics that they have is that the power availability is really, really high, like 99.97% up, which is quite remarkable. However, last night we lost phone service here at the farm, and it wasn't just us; it was an area outage. And we lost internet, we lost telephone, and just with losing those two things, it's amazing how quiet the farmhouse can get. Because no internet means, you can't read the news, you can't order things on the internet, you can't go to Amazon, You can't go to eBay. You can't get those oil filters. Without the telephone service, no one calls, no calls in, no calls out, no Netflix, no Amazon Prime television service. It's quiet. And we've become really dependent on electricity. Now, that was just losing the internet and phone. Now, losing the electricity or the power grid, that's really, really serious, because what happens in hospitals? What happens to people in surgery? What happens to the diagnostic equipment? I know that hospitals have generators, but they don't have generators to run everything in the hospital. They can only run selected devices at a time. So keep that in mind. This is pretty serious stuff. And Bert, when we come back, can we talk about some of the protection that we could do to prevent these things from happening? Because I know when you build systems, you have that in mind, and when I build systems, I have that in mind. And I'd like to talk about Faraday cages as well. Should we consider Faraday cages? Are fuses better than circuit breakers? We'll be right back. Bert Bertonis is with us, and we're talking about the power grid. We're talking about an EMP. And so what can be damaged, class? iPads, smartphones, cell phone towers, telephones, desktop computers, mainframes, jet aircraft system, routers, air traffic control systems, banking systems, hospital diagnostic machines, televisions, internet servers, pretty much anything with a micro processor or microchip. Yes.
Anything and everything.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know,
so what do we do?
Well, I was just thinking in the early days of microelectronics, we used to use circuits made out of CMOS. We still do, but the first CMOS circuits were so sensitive to static and electric charges that the gates would blow out just from touching them. I mean, you had to pack everything in special foil, and if you accidentally touched the leads of one of these integrated circuits, they'd be permanently damaged. And that was just, the static off of your body. So you can imagine what the effect would be of a mile-high electromagnetic pulse from a, 20 kiloton hydrogen bomb. So, so yes, we can shield our devices. We can put our phone in a metal bag. Typically in electronics, we have these metallized mylar bags. You can, if you know something's going to be occurring, you can do something as simple as just taking all your valuable electronics and putting them in a metal trash can, and that'll actually protect them. The problem is if it's strong enough pulse, you also have to protect yourself. So one thing you can do, and I'm surprised why more people aren't doing this, is build a metal garage. And you mentioned Faraday cage. A metal garage is actually a Faraday cage of sorts, and that will basically absorb the energy, and it'll be dissipated into the ground.
We have a metal garage. Actually, it's a metal barn. But it's not 100% sealed. That's the problem, isn't it? It's got a metal roof that is connected electrically to the metal sidewalls and the metal sliding door, but there's still gaps. There's still 6 inches or 4 inches of airspace underneath the sliding door so that we can slide the door in the wintertime. Is that sufficient, or is it not sufficient?
Well, it really depends on it's certainly going to help. It depends on the nature of the burst and how big the openings are. When we do electronic testing for radiation of devices to meet FCC rules, we use a Faraday cage, which is very tight screen, and pretty much nothing goes in or out of that cage. If you have some windows, that is going to allow some energy to get in, typically higher frequency energy. And will that be damaging or not? Really depends on how strong the burst was and what frequencies were in that burst. And hard to say, but it's certainly better than not being in that metal garage.
And I was also thinking, our class knows that I built a solar array, and I did everything I could to shield the cables from these electromagnetic pulses. So, for example, the wires that come from each solar panel, I put as many of them as possible in metal conduit. I'm talking about the stuff that you can buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, half-inch metal conduit, and I've grounded that because I'm trying to have fewer antennas, if you will, or wires that can act as antennas to pick up these electromagnetic pulses. Do you think that is aiding in protection, or am I just wasting my time?
No, absolutely. Shielded cables is one of the most important things you can do. In fact, you can even buy shielded power cables for your house, for your electrical wiring through your walls. But shielded cables, provided you do ground the shield, is one of the most effective ways to dissipate the energy and protect the cables, the wires inside the cables.
Now, you mentioned an ordinary metal galvanized trash can. I think they used to call them 40-gallon trash cans back in the 1960s. Now, do you recommend that they be attached to a grounding rod, driven, a metal rod driven several feet into the ground with a heavy wire, maybe 10-gauge wire attached to the garbage can, or is that not necessary?
I don't think it's necessary. I mean, we haven't done a lot of tests on this because obviously it hasn't happened. But the idea is to keep what's inside it from absorbing that energy. So whether the trash can actually is grounded or not, I don't think is going to make a big difference because the energy is not going to get inside it. And in any case, the trash can's typically sitting on the ground. My mind almost thinks that maybe it's worse if it's grounded because then it might act more as an antenna to attract some of this, the solar surge or an EMP, kind of like when you put I know in my house I have a wire through the roof, which is basically to absorb lightning, and that gets grounded. And that almost attracts it. I mean, it attracts it in a good way because it goes into the ground, but and that protects your house from lightning. But in the case of a garbage can, I think just having your stuff in the garbage can, close the lid, put it on the ground, I think that's fine.
Okay. Here's another question that I have for you. When I built this solar array, I'm talking about solar panels, and I've got 30 panels on one, well, actually 28 right now. There will be 30 panels on a rack. And I connected them to a charge controller with 10-gauge wire. Well, what I wanted to do was put fuses in between the solar panels and the charge controller. Not circuit breakers, but fuses. Bert, what is your thought on using an old-fashioned style fuse as compared to a circuit breaker for EMP-type protection?
I think it's a great idea, and the other thing I'd recommend, though, is keep an extra controller. Just keep it in a Mylar bag somewhere, where you can store it, because if your controller does blow out, have spares.
I do. I have a spare, and just as the way you've said, and I have spare fuses. And the reason I'm asking this is if you go to the internet, you can find something called a combiner box. And a combiner box will take strings of solar panels and combine them so that, let's say you have 3 panels at 32 volts apiece, and you have them in series, that'd be 32 plus 32 plus 32, or 96 volts. You take that 96 volt string and you combine it with other strings so that you have multiple strings from multiple panels all going into one box. And that then feeds the charge controller. Well, I bought, typically you just go to the internet and they have circuit breakers for that. Well, I bought fuses. They were kind of hard to find. And then in between those fuses and the charge controller, I bought an old 1950s or 1960s Montgomery Ward's home fuse panel with six fuses in it that you screw in like plug fuses. So I'm thinking that my plan is that if there is a failure, I'd sure like these fuses to do their job and to blow rather than have a longer delay with a circuit breaker. So Do you like that idea, or am I just spinning my wheels?
No, I think it's a good idea, and also it's hard to say how a circuit breaker might be affected also by a EMP or by a surge, and it's possible the circuit breaker might get destroyed. Now, your fuse is certainly going to get destroyed, but you just put a new one in. Mm-hmm. A circuit breaker, you might not have enough spares.
Mm-hmm. What I did in our barn, we've got another antenna. Since we're talking about EMPs, I'm just trying to give the class some examples of antennas. We have what's known as a electric fence, and what it is, it's a plastic polypropylene. Think of it like ribbon, 1/2 inch wide, and woven in that are 6 strands of stainless steel wires. And we use an electric fence charger to produce several thousand volts of electricity at a very low current. So if a cow leans up against this white plastic fence, they'll get a small shock like you would from static electricity, that kind of a feeling. They don't like it, so they don't go past the fence. But that fence is about a mile long, and it's a great antenna. So what I've done is to protect the rest of the house from lightning striking that electric fence, going through the electric fence charger, which is plugged into AC power, I've got an old antique fuse panel. So I'm using fuses there as well to further protect our house from a lightning strike that might hop onto our electric fence, quote, antenna, unquote. So are there other situations, Bert, that you can think of that we should protect ourselves with fuses if we choose to do that?
Boy, it's probably so many things that, some of them are probably just obvious, and anything basically where you're running wire. I mean, I'd say your burglar alarm system. I know in my case we use wired because it's more reliable than wireless, so you'd want to consider putting fuses in something like that. But really anything, especially if there's long lengths of wire, it's just prudent to do something like that, especially if you're designing the system or the home from something you're building from the start. It's easier to put it in.
Interesting that you say that, the burglar alarm system. In our farmhouse, we have telephone wire in the walls, and in the location in the farmhouse where I have a router, I have a surge protector for the telephone side of the router. And I thought, you know what? I'll get 2 of them, because I know one of them's going to blow. Well, when lightning has been in the area, it takes out it blows the telephone line surge protector. So I put another one in. A few weeks later, that one blew out. What I'm saying is they're doing their job protecting the electronic equipment. They're sacrificing themselves. And it's happening. And it's happening at a greater and greater frequency. Let's talk more about that. Class Bert Bertonis is with us. Bert, when we talk about electricity, for some reason we use the word power. I'm not sure why we use the word power, but we use it instead of the word electricity. And there are voltage spikes, there are brownouts, and there are blackouts, and there are momentary blackouts. Can you share with us what a power spike is?
Sure. Yeah, power spike is just a momentary surge in the voltage, and they occur anytime there's, for instance, if there's a power outage on one part of the system, just the power going off or shorting out in one location, even if it's disconnected from the power line, it sends a little spike traveling down the power line that can hit your refrigerator or other things in your house. Usually it's harmless, but it can destroy items. And interesting you mentioned that. One thing I've done in my circuit breaker, my main breaker box, I have 2 of the slots reserved for filters to actually filter out any surge. And the idea is you can buy these. They're, I don't know, maybe $20 or $30 a piece. And what you want to do is put them right as early as possible to when the power enters your house. And it's much like the surge protector you might have in a power strip for, your computers, but the idea is you're catching the surge right when it enters your house, and it's going to have the best effect on protecting everything in your house when you do it that way. So you can buy these just like you'd buy a circuit breaker, and just reserve 2 slots in your main breaker box, and you can put them in.
I have one on the kitchen table that I'm going to be installing for a friend of ours. He and I help each other in our area of Missouri, and I didn't tell him this, but I have an extra one. I bought about 7 of them at one time, and they are exactly what you're talking about. And you've been to our farmhouse here in Missouri, and what I've done is I have one of these whole house surge protectors at the main breaker panel, and it protects all of the electronics in the house. Then I have at each one of the sub-panels, I have another one, which would be called a sub-panel surge protector. And so it additionally protects devices. So, and then I have surge protection strips that I use for, sensitive equipment. So I'm doing my best to have as much surge protection as possible. But yesterday I've almost completed something that, I haven't seen before on the internet, and that was I installed whole house UPS, uninterruptible power. And what I did was I bought a large uninterruptible power device made by American Power Conversion, 1500 watts, and I ran a circuit into several rooms, like into the studio, into the kitchen, there's a couple there, and other places where we have computers, and including where we have a television with the Blu-ray player and other electronics. The point is that instead of having a UPS on the floor at each device, I just bought one, and then empowering a whole bunch of devices with it. Have you seen that in your world?
Well, not on that scale. How big were your batteries?
It's a 24-volt system, and the plan is ultimately to hook it up to 12 volts of 500 ampere-hour battery string. So I could run days if I wanted to.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a great idea. So I know we're running out of time. I thought I'd give a little bit of good news. Your vacuum tube radio is going to survive, and generally your car will survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess the reason the car will survive is because we've got spark plugs going off 25,000 or more volts, or 40 or 50,000 volts under the hood anyway. So the engineers have figured out we better protect our computers under the hood as well. I guess that's the reason, isn't it?
Metal body. So
yeah.
That would rule out the Corvette.
And the Lotus. Yeah. Bert, thank you so much for being with us and spending
Enjoyed it.
Non-replaceable time. Thanks again. Class, above all, honesty and integrity. What happens next is up to you.